І завершає нашу сьогоднішню сесію ще один наш польський колега Миколай Павляк, який виступить на надзвичайно актуальну тематику поле біженців в Польщі, постання цієї проблеми, європеїзація і захоплення популістами.
I see that the level of cortisol is so high in the room that I should be mostly talking about myself. But I will talk about the issue of asylum protection and policies regarding the refugees in Poland in the last 20 years. Although I'm very much using the data from the research project I'm running together with my 3 colleagues, so I'm very much in debt to them, and I have to mention them in the beginning: Adriana Mika, Anna Horolec, and Paweł Kubicki, with whom we are working on the book about Polish, Hungarian, and Romanian reaction towards refugee crisis. But today I'm going to talk only about Poland, and not only about refugee crisis, but the whole transformations of the refugee policies in Poland since the beginning of the 90s. Okay, so I will start with some guiding notions, and then I will describe the transformations of that field. And the main, well, I'm not from this kind of paradigm where you are testing 6 hypotheses. The research question I will be trying to answer with my data is how the fact that a certain field of policy is visible for the external audience, is being a point of attention of general public, is changing how the policies are created and then implemented. Okay? And to whom the important actors in a given field are orienting themselves, how it is changing the policies. Okay, let's quickly start with an asylum. This is, some say this is universal institution, but in fact, many scholars, and recommend you reading the last book by Jennifer Welsh, are highlighting that at least what we are now calling asylum protection or refugee regime is a product of modernity. Yes, of the national state's obsession with purification, ideologies fighting each other, causing forced migrations. And again, the idea that we have international law binding contracting states to certain norms and regulations is also a product of modernity. Now we have the so-called Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugees, which was announced in 1951 as a response of the international community to the displacement of people after the Second World War. But now it's a general regime regarding the refugee, which is a forced migration. People are running from the persecution from the countries which are unable to protect them. Because we have to remember persecution and disability of a given state to protect its citizens or its residents, because sometimes mistakenly people are associating refugee migration with armed conflicts. It's not only caused by armed conflicts, it's, for example, caused by dictators. Yeah, so refugees are flying from countries which are not at war as well. You know, because of the conflict in Syria and all European dispute about the refugees from Syria, there is a very strong connotation between forced migration and war, which is not exactly true. In case of Europe, we have very much harmonized policy regarding, in case of European Union, we have harmonized policies towards forced migration. It's called Common European Asylum System, which started being developed since 1999. I'm not going into details of this European Union regulations, but one of the most important elements is so-called Dublin regulation, so that's why some people call this Dublin paradigm or Dublin consensus, which is stating that the first country of the European Union to which asylum seeker is arriving, so the person looking for the protection, before the country is recognizing that person as a refugee, it has to be the country recognizing or checking if that person is a refugee. And the idea, and actually it was forced on the frontier countries of the European Union, was brought up by the rich countries from the core of Union who didn't like to have many refugees coming to the center of the European Union. They wanted them to be left on the countries at the borders. And this is now the element of the dispute in the whole European Union, because at least two countries, or actually three countries, but mostly Italy and Greece, are unable to host all the refugees which are coming through the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, another guiding notion for me is a notion of ignorance. We have in sociology a very long tradition of sociology of knowledge, but recently the field of sociology of ignorance is developing. And the ignorance is not just simple opposition of knowledge, because ignorance could be also used strategically, plus we are unable to know everything. Yes? So sometimes we have to rationally not know some things. Yes? Also, ignorance might be used as a resource, yes? And sometimes as a tool of authority. Powerful actors are able to manage with what not so powerful actors know or are ignorant of. But on the other hand, ignorance, sometimes we have this very, in some assumptions about the rational policy making, we think that if we have all the evidence and possibility to rationally create policies, so if we are not ignorant, the policy outcomes would be also more rational. Yeah, but what is one of questions interesting for me and my colleagues is that actually there is quite often the opposite. If the broader public is ignorant of an issue, it is being run in a more rational way. Although saying such things is a bit controversial, yes, because on the other hand it is against the principles of democracy, that the public opinion should know everything. And I'm not saying, my idea is not to hide anything from the public, but to, we have, as we were talking about our emotional capabilities in the previous presentation, we have also cognitive capabilities. So the even a rational public is unable to know everything about the policies run by a given state. Okay, and the last guiding notion is the notion of a field, because my analysis is a case study of a certain field in Poland. It's a field of a policy, but the policy is created not only by the state, it's co-created by some other actors. And in case of migration policy, and this sub-element of migration policy, which is regarding the forced migration, there are all sorts of other organizational, mostly organizational actors involved. Yes, for example, non-governmental organizations or international organizations like United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or sometimes very powerful charity organizations, or organizations which are implementing the policy on the local level, like schools, welfare centers, and so on. And so they are all engaged in a given meso-level social order in which they are negotiating the meanings, discussing the meanings, fighting over the definitions of important notions, and so on. But my idea is that we can talk about some macro processes, for example, political and social changes in Poland, by focusing on given social fields. In that case, we are going to focus on the social fields which is relevant for the policy regarding the asylum protection or broader international protection. Okay, let's talk how it emerged in Poland, the field. Although, as I said before, asylum seeking is a quite universal phenomena, and in Poland it started in the early 1990s. Yeah, but important caveat is that also even in communist Poland, which was mostly the country of political emigration by people persecuted by communist authorities, And there were also cases of refugee-like immigration. We accepted a group of Greek communists just after the Greek Civil War in the 40s. There were also Chilean refugees coming in the 70s after President Allende was, after the Pinochet putsch in Chile. So we had such kind of experiences, but it was not in a framework of the international law of Geneva Convention. So 1990, just after our break with the communism, Poland was recognized as a democratic and safe country, and one of the symbolic ways of this recognition was given by the Sweden, who sent back the ferry with migrants who were seeking for asylum in Sweden, but they traveled to Poland, which is a bit ironic. They were from Somalia and Syria, so the countries which are also now sending quite large numbers of forced migrants. So Ystad is a port in the south of Sweden, quite close to Poland, to small port in western Poland, Świnoujście, beautiful name, and they were sent back. And it was like a moment of creation of a field, yes, because the fact that the group of people came to Poland and someone had to take care of them, yes, the issue emerged, and then the response to that issue, which was in the framework of certain organization and reaction of the state, appeared. Poland became a contracting party of Geneva Convention 1 year later, and the institution of international protection became a part of Polish regulations on migrants. It's a very interesting story of institutionalization and, let's say, increasing complexity of organizational response to the issue. The number of articles in legal regulations since the beginning of the 90s is increasing, regulating the acceptance of refugees. In fact, since 2003, we have a separate legal act only devoted to international protection. Since 2001, we have separate national agency dealing mostly with international protection, but also with other kinds of migration. So we see that, and it is quite common finding of sociology of organizations, that if there is an issue and the organized response to that issue is emerging, then it's getting more and more complicated. Not only there is more and more organizations dealing with an issue, but these organizations are more and more sophisticated, having branches, sub-branches, more complicated internal regulations, and so on. Plus, the field was growing as more and more organizational actors were included into that field. As I said, we had started dealing with teaching the refugee children, welfare centers since some point took the responsibility for so-called integration of refugees and so on. So more and more actors were involved in that process, although it was still not visible. Yes, the actors for the field, it was important issue. Sometimes there were heated debates internal to that field, but it was not recognized by broader public. Politicians in Poland were not giving any statements about the migration or forced migration at all. Another important jolt for that field was the fact that Poland was accepted as a member of the European Union in 2004. And as I said before, European Union is running common asylum policy, so Poland had to accept the acquis communautaire also in regards to the asylum protection. Thanks to the Dublin regulation, asylum seekers, many of asylum seekers got stuck in Poland. Actually, since 2000, and so-called Second Chechen War, where the majority of asylum seekers in Poland were coming from Chechnya to Russia and Belarus, border checkpoint in Terespol, and being frankly with you, they were having plans of traveling to the Western Europe, but thanks to the European internal regulations, they had to process their asylum applications in Poland. Yeah? So, in a sense, the forced migrants were forced to stay in a given country. But also being a member of the European Union makes some other actors much stronger. For example, part of the common asylum European system is internal European funds focusing on assisting refugees, assisting development of this asylum system, or integrating refugees. So some actors got much stronger because they had access to certain resources. So orientation toward of the actors from the field toward the policies developed in Brussels or in agreement between the European member states was crucial for how the field was shaped and for the architecture of that field. We could say that the asylum policy in Poland was managed in technocratic way, without wider public debate, mostly according to the guidelines by European Commission. And there was a public ignorance of the asylum protection in our country. Maybe only 2 incidents were mentioned in media. It was around 2006, 2007, but there was no broader debate. Political parties didn't have an idea about this policy. I'm not only saying that they didn't have a policy about it, but they didn't have an idea. They were not interested in it. Things this is one, maybe to illustrate it, to illustrate this technocratic manner of management of the policy is I analyzed the amendments of the Polish National Act on International Protection, and the only reasons between the years 2003 and 2015 to amend this act were changes in the European regulations, which Poland had to transport to its national country. Though there is no amendments in the National Act because someone came out with a proposal, we have to change something in our regulations. It was like driven from the outside. This is good indicator to persuade you at least that these policies were created because of the key actors oriented to a certain audience, to the certain perceived audience, or to a certain actor, which was, let's say, making it more simple, European Commission. But the things changed in 2015 when the large numbers of people were crossing Mediterranean, actually Aegean Sea from Turkey to Greece, and we had quite a lot of media coverages of people on board, very dramatic coverages of people drowning in the sea, and then a huge debate about decision of Angela Merkel to invite people arriving in Greece to Germany, and then media coverages of this, let's say, exodus of people traveling from Greece through Macedonia, Serbia, Hungary, Austria to Germany, heated debate, and in case of Poland, it coincided with the parliamentary elections. So suddenly the idea of the issue of asylum became a topic of electoral campaign. But it was only, in case of Poland, it was let's say, a produce of media debate, because as you probably know, the route was going through from Greece to Germany, and the actual number of asylum applicants in Poland was stable in the last period because they were coming from a different region, not from the Middle East, not from Syria, but rather from Caucasus. What contributed to the heat of the debate was the so-called relocation scheme introduced by European Commission. So the idea that every member state of European Union will have to accept a share of asylum seekers from Greece and Italy. And 2 member states refused this scheme. This is Hungary and Austria, and Poland actually officially never refused this scheme, but it never fulfilled its pledge because of the change of governments. Yes, before the election, one government, former government, accepted their plan of relocation, but the other government was not fulfilling the pledge. So to Poland, as to Austria and Hungary, never relocated asylum seekers from Italy or Greece, never arrived. We can see the picture of the debate in the data from the opinion polls. What's for me, it's interesting that institutionalization of an issue as a social problem is reflected in the fact that the leading polling agency in Poland included the question about accepting refugees to its monthly omnibus survey. Before that, they were asking it from time to time, the questions about forced migration, but since the autumn 2015, it's one of the regular questions. And you can see on that plot that, this is how you do it. Aha, okay. Great. So, spring 2015, only 21% of Polish people would refuse acceptance of asylum seekers. During the summer and during the electoral campaign, it started increasing, and this attitude of rejection of accepting refugees since the autumn, early winter of 2015 stabilized at the number of people. There is more than a half. Yeah, so there was a change of attitude toward the topic, but actually it was a creation of attitude because people before were ignorant mostly about this topic. And because the opinion developed, and it was negative opinion, it started driving the interest of politicians. What we are doing as researchers now, we are very deeply now coding media coverages. Now I'm going to show you some, just as an illustration. This is not proper empirical material, but this is very interesting statement produced by the Polish politicians. This is, I think the proper name for this kind of picture is meme, but it's not a meme made by someone to ridicule the politician, but it's actually made by his campaigners. This gentleman here is a Polish Minister of Interior, and it is a quote from the interview with him made a month ago, and this was distributed by his party, which is now ruling Poland, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość. Yeah, so what he's saying now, Law and Justice, the name of the party, takes care of Poles' security. Yeah, because the issue of forced migration, which is at least in assumption of the Geneva Convention related to humanitarianism, to help people which are in danger of prosecution, is now attached to the issue of security. It's because of the terrorist attacks in Western Europe. Of course, as we know, the terrorists in Western Europe are not refugees or not connected to refugees. They are usually second generation of labor migrants from 60s, as in case of France or Belgium, but making things simpler in this kind of messages, politicians connect refugees with second generation migrants in Western Europe. And the politician Mariusz Błaszczak is saying, in Poland there is no terrorist attacks because we drew from the PO-PSL, it's the name of the parties which were creating the former government, decisions. Relocation of asylum seekers does not solve the problem, it is making it more persistent. Yeah, so this is a kind of a climate in which politicians who got interested in a topic now are putting some pressure in order to create policies. And since that period, we have first amendments on the regulations on asylum protection in Poland, which are not initiated by the changes of the European level regulations, but they are the ideas developed internally in Poland, because there is a focus on the issue, public focus on the issue. And to start concluding, because it's quite late and we need some conclusions out of it. So we say that the the so-called refugee crisis, public ignorance of the problem facilitated the implementation of technocratic-driven policies. The moment in which public stopped being ignorant about it opened a kind of a window of opportunity to larger changes of the policies. Usually, referring to Kingdom idea of windows of policy opportunities. When there is a huge attention to the issue, there is a change of making more radical change of it. But in case of Poland, this window of opportunity was seized by populist discourse. So it was not used, this opportunity, to change a kind of a routine management of a field, but the shock to the field was used in order to start the more populist discourse, connecting the forced migration to the issues of security, disconnecting it from the issues of humanitarian reasons. And connecting the issue of forced migration with not only security in case of securing the borders, but also in connecting it to the threat of terrorist attacks, which is now reshaping the field and actions of also smaller actors involved in the field, because they have to orient to the broader public, which is more concentrated with these issues. So we do not have any more ignorance about the issue, but ignorance always have to be there, because you cannot know everything what's going on in a given area of interest. So even if you do not have the ignorance about the fact that there is such a phenomenon as refugees, you are still ignorant about the humanitarian reasons for migration, or you have to forget or hide some elements, some factors causing it, or parallel to it, or associated to it. You have to pick and build this kind of working theories about the certain social problem. So the ignorance is always there. But the most important thing is that against the, let's say, intuitive assumption, the fact that the public is not ignorant anymore, it doesn't bring the rationality in. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, questions, comments? May I?
Yes, please.
Well, I'm not an expert on asylum and migration issues, but as far as I understood, kind of this issue of migration and asylum seekers has been played very vigorously and energetically by the populist movements basically across the European Union. And kind of, is it legitimate to claim that kind of the trend you've witnessed and documented in case of Poland, the seizure of the issue of asylum protection by the populists, is a general European Union trend, and Brexit and French election can be partially explained by this factor?
I would be afraid to explain the Brexit. We have Brexit specialists here, and French elections. And I think the public attention to the issue of migration is shaped differently in these countries, because they have much more longer tradition of immigration, and the public knowledge about migration is much more complicated. But I can tell you a few things about mostly Central Europe, Eastern members of European Union, where the things are more or less similar as in Poland. Yes, Hungary very much very strong opposition towards accepting refugees, expressed by Prime Minister Orban, some of his policies are very, I would say, shocking. And what's shocking and also ironic in it is that fact in the modern construction of asylum regime, Hungarians were the first category of refugees which were relocated. After 1956, there was the first relocation scheme in Europe when 200,000 Hungarian refugees were relocated between the Western European countries. So this is very interesting. In Slovakia, attitudes are more or less the same, anti-immigration. Czech Republic, not so much, but also, in Romania, which we are researching, the attitudes are not so anti-immigrant. It was not such a hot topic of the debate. And what's also interesting, Romania is the country, although it's recognized as one of the poorest among these countries, it's accepting the largest share of the relocation scheme. So it's really interesting, and I still have no clues how to explain what's going on in Romania, why it's so different to other countries. Because in Bulgaria, again, we have also strong anti-immigrant attitudes in these regards. And it's very much connected to creation of the issue, of this public image of making connotations between various actually distant phenomena. Terrorism in Western Europe, Islamism, which actually many people fleeing from Syria are fleeing from Islamists. Yes, majority of them are fleeing from the Assad, who is a threat for the part of the population. But so there is created this phantomous danger which is used by politicians. But actually, this whole discourse about refugees in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, is, well, I would never even not say that it's a populist discourse, because it entered mainstream of the politics. Maybe it's even, maybe it's a sign that all the politics here is now populist, because I could also put you a picture not only of the currently governing Minister of Interior, but also of a leader of the opposition, who should be at least trying not to be populist in order to build his public image as a not populist in opposition to the government, but he's saying more or less the same things about the refugees in Poland. Yes? So it's very, very interesting phenomena with which I have problems with explaining it. This seizure is so strong that it actually became a mainstream. Yes, so of course I'm not saying that everyone in countries in our region is anti-refugee, anti-immigrant. There is also refugee welcome movement, but it's becoming marginalized. It's becoming marginalized.
Could you put the refugee convention slide back up? I think your perspective is really very interesting, and I think you're absolutely right.
Thank you.
That strategic ignorance allowed a technocratic response to refugees. Sorry, so slow. Yeah. But something I find very troubling with the European response to the refugee crisis is that both sides are misrepresenting the issue in order to promote their own viewpoint. So the populists, you correctly indict the populists for making a connection between refugees and terrorism, when really, if there is any connection, it is minuscule. And I agree with you, and the populists have misrepresented that issue. But I think you yourself, as an expert, misrepresented the refugee convention and the Hungarian situation. The Hungarian refugees of 1956 generation were very much people persecuted for political opinion and could not stay in Hungary because of their political opinion. They were members of a specific group, thus entitled to protection under the refugee convention. But most of the refugees arriving from Syria in Europe in 2015 2015 and 2016, were young men who were living in refugee camps in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, who had no job prospects in those camps, no educational opportunities in those camps, and came to Europe to find better opportunities. Now, those are not members of a specific social group who are facing persecution. In fact, even in general, the Refugee Convention doesn't handle civil wars. I mean, the Refugee Convention doesn't handle famine. There are people fleeing famine in Africa who have real reasons to be refugees. I don't deny that they're refugees, but they are not refugees for reasons of the Refugee Convention. That is, fleeing famine or needing a job are not reasons. Yet, these people have been presented by European experts, by liberals in Europe, as people who obviously should be covered by refugee law. And so on the one hand, the populists have presented an incorrect image. But I think the liberals have also presented an incorrect image, have misrepresented the truth in order to promote their own political viewpoint. And I'm curious if you do have a response to that.
Okay, it's a really, let's say, good point, but I think according to the way you are trying to think about regulation, legal regulation, I would say that it's impossible to simply represent it. It's always a matter of construction. Yes, and a refugee is a constructed figure. There is no such a real thing as a refugee. We are constructing refugees using international regulations, and that's true. It's very strong liberal tradition also in refugee studies, mostly inspired by cultural anthropology. It's like, and this tradition of refugee studies is criticizing the fact that a certain social actor, in that case of very low agency, very close to be excluded, is just constructed by regulations. Yeah, and that's true. Probably majority of these people who are crossing the Aegean Sea would not receive the refugee status if they would be processed properly, if the Greece would be capable of processing them. But still, according to the Geneva Convention, but not the article I presented here, but the very important article about non-refoulement, they have the right to be processed as refugees. And another thing in which you are very right, and it is very complicated, but it's more referring to the problem of international relations. They were not directly prosecuted. They were already in Jordan, Libya. The ones coming to Greece were coming from the camps in Turkey. And this is also showing not only it's element of ignorance, because Europeans in 2015 got so panicking about so-called waves of people crossing the sea, but actually in the whole European Union there is less Syrian refugees than in Lebanon, which is a very small country and being now under the huge crisis of having 10% of population people living there being refugees in camps. But the idea, and which is also a part of the Geneva Convention of the refugee international regime, is that there is that idea in international community of sharing the burden. So if it is impossible to secure the, let's say, regular life for refugees in certain countries, if we think that they will have to be in so-called procured refugee situation, living in camps, yes, it means that there is still something to be solved. I'm not saying that this is the perfect solution. Let's just invite them and use this regulation to create them as refugees. And this political view is always ignorant of something. This is my point, and this is our idea of the sociology of ignorance, that always you have to be ignorant of something when you are creating kind of a knowledge. Yes, but you're right, maybe, yeah, I would have to be more balanced and show the elements of ignorance in different political pictures of that issue, yes? Because these are all constructions.
Can I briefly?
Yeah.
When we think of the success of populism today, I think we have to put it in the context of the lies that liberals are telling today. That is, populism thrives when liberals tell a lie and don't want to be challenged. So, for example, if I tell my population, you must accept refugees, it's the law, well, then people resist that. But if the narrative were, there's terrible suffering, why don't we help these people? We don't have to, we have no legal obligation, but we're civilized people, and we're human beings, and we care. And I think that's what's missing from the liberal narrative. Not your narrative, again, we're talking about the European liberal narrative, is that the European Union and its institutions seem to be telling the European people, you have to do this whether you like it or not, instead of making a political appeal to people. We would be better human beings if we did this. And I think that also, I mean, I don't speak Polish, but my understanding of the Polish debate is that there's been very little, that nobody in the Polish debate has been saying we should accept 10,000 refugees because we're Catholics and we have a sense of responsibility for the suffering of others as Catholics. Instead, they're saying you must accept them because the EU said so. And that's a different logic.
Yeah, and you pointed to the interesting issue how certain ideologies are used in order to legitimize policies. And in Poland for a very long time, legitimizing some policies by saying it's an idea, it's a European policy. Yes, it was like closing all the debate. And I think the people who were members of government during the crisis, they simply thought it's enough. Yeah? And what's ironic in this situation, the ones who pointed to the help to suffering, to the humanitarian aspect of the issue were the Catholic clergy in Poland, yes, who were not heard by the Catholic voters voting for the politicians who present themselves as Catholics but using quite often even not only populist language but xenophobic languages. This is what is very interesting, but I don't think it simply covers the definition of populism that at least in Poland and what I understand, but I'm not sure if it is like this, it is in the USA now. The most important factor is to being against the elites. Yeah? I don't think, I'm not sure, maybe it's a good starting point for this discussion in order to develop the definition of populism. But what I see in Polish politics, it's mostly being counter-elitist.
I agree to a certain extent with what Salvatore said, but I think it's also quite important to understand a bit of the background as to why there has been a technocratic solution by the EU, which is, you know, if we just look at Italy, Italy has taken, my understanding is something of the order of about 1 million people have come into Italy from North Africa over the better part of about a decade. I think it's sometimes a bit harsh to sort of say, well, you know, should we really be giving them because it's a famine or whatever, but you've got to remember, in certain places in Africa, the famine has been man-created by the governments in terms of rewarding supporters and penalising opponents. And now Zimbabwe is a classic example of that. But I think, just going back to Italy, the problem is that most people effectively sat on their hands. And I think there was a reasonable decision taken by the people in Brussels that Italy, particularly with its issues of, economy going nowhere, it was unreasonable to expect Italy just to absorb all these refugees on its own. I think there was then a try to craft a European-wide decision or solution to this, which I have to say, whether you might call it a liberalism gone wrong, but I think it was a fair and an honest approach being taken to a problem that was essentially impacting Italy considerably by virtue of its geography. And I think the similar situation was developing in Greece because of its proximity to Turkey. So I think there was a European-wide decision. I think whether the people should have gone out and actively sold that policy, just remains to be seen, because I think that could lead again to a sort of a demand, a pulling event. We're going to accept tens of thousands, and therefore you have people heading for the boats. So I think it wasn't quite a sort of a liberal lie. I think it was a genuine rationale for doing it, but that has led to mounting political issues in virtually the whole of not just Europe, but I mean, let's not ignore the United States has got a problem. You also will hear particular issues in other parts of the world with, I think Muslim refugees fleeing particular places in Burma. It's not just a European issue, it is a global phenomenon. And I think, the solutions to that have generally been used by the populists for political purposes to create a sense of fear, and we need to crack down. That's my comment on that.
Well, it's a comment. I don't have to answer it.
That's okay. That's just a comment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all the presenters. Шановні друзі, перед тим, як оголосити закритим нашу сьогоднішню сесію, хочу привітати ідеолога нашої конференції, її тематики, Дона Кальба. Він буде завтра виступати, так що завтра ми продовжуємо нашу роботу в форматі пленарного засідання. Маємо двох доповідачів сьогоднішнього дня, Кріса і Сальваторе, і до них приєднаються Світлана Костюкевич з Білорусі і Дон Кальб. Так що до зустрічі завтра о 10-й годині тут. Всім дякую за участь, за питання, за дискусію. Але, як то кажуть, last but not least, а в першу чергу дякую нашим доповідачам за надзвичайно цікавий, жвавий і живий внесок до дискурсу про болючі проблеми сучасності. Дякую і до завтра.